The idea of President Trump saying to one of these agitators on the campus of Columbia University, as they're on campuses all across America, you're being deported. Well, he's got a green card. Well, there are rules and there are laws that discuss that just because you have a green card does not make you a U.S. citizen. And if you're going to act in certain ways, things can happen. But this is going to the courts. There's no question about it. Really, I think what we're having a question about is, what do we expect from our universities? What do we expect from immigration as a whole? Can we say that there's a standard? Tony Katz today. Good to be with you. William Jacobson joins us right now, Cornell law professor, the mind behind legalinsurrection.com. Now you've got the story up there at Legal Insurrection. ICE detained Columbia activist in Trump crackdown on pro-Palestinian protests. And you and I think, may both agree that the term pro-Palestinian is one that's utilized to counter true intention. But let's start with the basics. What is it that the Trump administration, specifically the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is saying about this guy and these actions?
Well, what they're saying is that this person, Mahmoud Khalil, has violated various provisions that apply to green card holders, and that he is deportable, and they are moving to do that. So he's currently, to my knowledge, based on what was reported as recently as last night, is in ICE custody, apparently in Louisiana. And his supporters are in court in New York City, in the Southern District of New York, where a judge has ordered the government not to deport him temporarily until the judge can figure out what's going on. So that's where things stand. But the basic premise is that this person violated the terms and conditions of his green card, which apparently has, and there's a lot we don't necessarily know, but he apparently has some sort of more permanent status than just a student visa, and that he's deportable. And we don't know the full grounds on which the government is claiming that. I haven't seen a document that says that. We only know kind of public statements, but there is a suggestion that he has expressed support for a designated terrorist group, Hamas. There are suggestions that some of the conduct he engaged in, he's not really just an activist. He was allegedly the organizer and leader of a long string of violent actions at Columbia University, including building takeovers, harassment of students, blockades, all those sort of things. He was one of the organizers. So this is not a guy who's a great guy. Okay, let's put it that way, based on what's been reported. This is a guy who may have some rights because he has a green card, but the government is saying, we don't want this sort of person here.
Now, you make the important distinction, talking to William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, legalinsurrection.com. And I know immigration law isn't your field of study, so I'm not going to press too hard. The difference between a visa holder and a green card holder being a lawful permanent resident. And there is a difference here. I think this does, however, make us ask, when we take a look at universities like Columbia or NYU or a lot of these places that bring in foreign students, and very often you see foreign students being very anti-West, anti-capitalist, certainly anti-Israel. It makes you wonder why we allow these things to happen. Is it your theory as an observer that this conversation could lead to the greater conversation regarding student visas as a whole?
Yeah, well, you don't need to be an immigration law expert to know, if you're here just on a student visa, it's not quite the protection level as when you have a green card, which is some level of permanent resident alienship. But even a green card, you have limitations. And I think the government will have to come forward at some point with the proof that he violated the law, and he violated the provisions of the law that would allow them to deport him. I would not be surprised. I have no information that they're going to do this, but I would not be surprised if they also went over the applications that were filed for him to get a green card, because there are a series of questions there. And I don't know under what basis he got the green card, but it might have been his wife's application for him because she apparently is an American citizen. And there are a series of questions there that may have been answered incorrectly. I don't know if they were or they weren't, but just looking at some of the questions there, has this person ever advocated persecution of someone based on race or religion? Have they ever advocated, the use of violence based on religious beliefs, things like that? So there may be things that they can find in the application that would give rise to it. I'm not saying there are such things, but that would be very common. I remember a case about a decade ago involving another Palestinian woman who came here, Razmia Odeh, who lied on her visa application and lied on her naturalization papers about having been a member of a terrorist organization. And they did commence proceedings and end up revoking her citizenship and her status here and deported her. And the way they did it is by going over her application and finding inaccurate answers. So I would imagine that as the government moves forward, it will, one, come forward with more proof. There have been suggestions that they have information about this guy beyond what's in the media. And I would also think they will now start to go over his green card application and maybe even his student visa application and see if there were any lies on that and use that as a basis.
And that's I think where people are, sir. Talking to William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, legalinsurrection.com. It's the idea of revocation. We're not talking about a citizen here, and the question is there a different standard? It would seem obvious that the answer is yes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio seems to be saying yes as well, but this really does bring itself to a larger conversation about crackdowns on college campuses. You work on a college campus, you see these things, especially at Cornell, up close. You see them at NYU and Columbia. You see them. I live in Indiana. We've seen things happen at Indiana University and USC and other places across the country. This seems to be the administration really making a stronger statement of we're not going to tolerate these things here. So is this the role of government? Can they legally say to the university set, whether regardless of the university, public, private, etc., we're not going to allow these things on your campus?
Well, I think you have to distinguish. Immigration is a very different situation than someone who's a U.S. citizen. The government can't deport, to my knowledge, a U.S. citizen. Okay, they can either prosecute you for a crime or they have to leave you alone, pretty much. But when you're here on an immigration, whether it's a visa or a green card, you're playing by a different set of rules. You have no right to be here unless you comply with the rules, unlike U.S. citizens. And so it's a very different situation. And I think the government does have a key role there. It does have an interest and a right to keep people out who give support for terrorism. It's right in the statute. Who give support for designated terrorist groups. Whether this person did or not is something they'll have to prove. Whether they engage in criminal activity while here, something they're going to have to prove. But if they can prove all of those things, there's no reason why we as a country need to let in people who come here for the very purpose of not only advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government, not only advocating the destruction of our society, but engaging in organizing violent conduct, harassing conduct. Remember, this guy deprived hundreds, if not thousands, of Columbia students of their rights. He deprived them of their right to education. He deprived them of their right to speech through these crazy, violent, intimidating marches that they did and checkpoints and not allowing students to get to class. So this is not a guy who has respected anybody else's rights, yet we as a country will respect his rights to the extent he has them. This is not a free speech issue. If you were going to prove, as they claim, that he's only being prosecuted because he's quote unquote pro-Palestinian, then you would have to find similar conduct by a pro-Israel student, which is not prosecuted. The problem with these free speech arguments by the anti-Israel crowd is they are the only ones taking over buildings. They are the only ones trashing buildings. They are the only ones intimidating staff. So it's not equal. Don't tell me that he's being persecuted for Palestinian views, because Israelis are not doing this on campuses.
Oh, so is that their free speech argument, that it's only because he's got a quote unquote pro-Palestinian point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Look at all the things they're saying. They're saying he is being persecuted um, because of his pro-Palestinian views. And I'm saying that if you're going to make that argument, you have to point to a similar circumstance where a pro-Israel student engaged in similar conduct and was not prosecuted or not deported, or an Israeli student was not deported. And they can't do that because the only people trashing the campus, the only people intimidating other people on the campuses, the only people setting up, checkpoints on campuses and declaring Zionist-free zones like happened at UCLA are the so-called pro-Palestinian crowd. They are being held accountable because they're the only ones engaging in this conduct. It has nothing to do with free speech. And it's unfortunate that a bunch of organizations are rallying around him on the free speech issue when that's not the question.
Talking to William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, legalinsurrection.com. I think it's important to make that free speech differentiation, which would bring us into where does that differentiation lie? Is it free speech to say Israel should be destroyed? And does it stop being free speech when you're trying to physically stop somebody from crossing the campus? Don't get me wrong. I think these people are deplorable, awful, terrible people. And no, I think people like this should be removed from the nation if they are not citizens, which citizen is a different terminology than being a lawful permanent resident. But where does the free speech seem to run afoul of the law as it exists? Where does that argument run afoul?
Well, I think there's several different levels. One, at what point does it become conduct? Okay, so if you're blocking somebody from entering a building, that's not free speech. If you are taking over a building and trashing it, that's not free speech. So those things are not protected. And to the extent he or anybody else engaged in those, they are not protected. Now, if you're a U.S. citizen, you're either charged criminally or you're left alone. But if you're here on a visa or a green card, there's one more remedy there, and that's to kick you out of the country for that sort of conduct. So that's the conduct part of things. And I don't know if that's what the government's going to base it on. But there also is federal law that would apply, or at least it's been cited by a lot of people, that would apply even to green card holders, that expressing support for terrorism, expressing support for terrorist organizations might be protected if you're a U.S. citizen, but it also might violate the terms and conditions under which you're allowed to be in the U.S. if you're a foreigner. And so that's the other question. There are some limitations in the immigration code on quote unquote free speech done by people here who are on visas or are on green cards. That law, to my knowledge, has never been challenged. Maybe this will be the case where it gets challenged on constitutional basis. But the control of immigration has always been given to the executive branch a lot of leeway. I mean, the president has the right to shut the borders, literally shut the borders and not allow anybody in. He has that right. And to the extent he allows people in, I don't mean he personally, but the government allows people in under terms and conditions, they're entitled to enforce those terms and conditions. And if one of those terms and conditions is if you're a foreigner coming here on a visa or a green card, you cannot express support for a terrorist group. Is that constitutional? Is it not? Maybe the courts will decide, but I don't know if it's ever been challenged before.
And I don't think there's a question this is going to go to the Supreme Court. The federal immigration law in question is Section 1182, which talks about those who, if quote, engaged in terrorist activities or quote, members of terrorist organizations, and the possibility of endorsing or espousing terrorist activity. While I still have about 30 seconds with you, sir, this is going to the Supreme Court, right? Like, is there a do not pass go here?
I don't know. I think it's going to the Supreme Court if the lower courts rule in his favor. I don't know if the Supreme Court's going to take this one. So I would not automatically say it's going to the Supreme Court. I think that the law is pretty clear. And unless a judge is going to hold that law unconstitutional, I don't see a basis to go to the Supreme Court.
William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, legalinsurrection.com. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. More is coming up. I'm Tony Katz. This is Tony Katz Today.